The 9/11 attacks sent shockwaves across the international community and launched the global campaign against terrorism. 20 years later, the United States and its European allies have continued to wage their so-called wars on terror. But has the failure of the Afghanistan mission shown them to be a failure? Successive US leaders have carried out counter-terrorism strategies in over 80 countries. Meanwhile, domestically, the years after the 9/11 attacks have seen the expansion of mass surveillance for some communities and deepening political divisions. Hello, welcome to the programme. 2 decades on, the United States and its European partners are being questioned over the success of the war on terror after the Taliban's takeover in Afghanistan. What has been the impact of the war on terror and how has it shaped Western policies?
September 11th, 2001. 4 planes flying over the United States were seized by hijackers and used to carry out suicide attacks against American targets. Nearly 3,000 people were killed, with thousands more injured, in the most lethal terrorist attack in history. 2 decades on, it remains a moment of deep-seated trauma, seared into collective memories around the world, and defining the presidency of George W. Bush.
Either you're with us, either you love freedom, and with nations which embrace freedom, or you're with the enemy.
The war on terror was a controversial phrase and ultimately a controversial military campaign, a conflict with many fronts, reaching well beyond the 9/11 attackers. It would shape not just foreign policy agendas, but result in an entirely new approach to civil liberties, and leave a controversial legacy, not just because of the abuse of prisoners at the Bagram detention site, Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, but also in the targeting of communities through counter-terrorism measures. US forces killed al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden 10 years ago, but while the network was badly disrupted in Iraq, it's now been largely supplanted by another group, Daesh. And with the Taliban back in control of Afghanistan, it seems 20 years of warfare against terrorism has achieved anything but victory. So what is the legacy of the so-called war on terror?
Well, joining us on Roundtable today in Birmingham, here in the UK, Moazzam Begg, former detainee at Guantanamo Bay and outreach director at the campaign group CAGE. In Boston, Sahar Aziz, visiting distinguished professor of law at Boston University and the author of The Racial Muslim. And in London, we're joined by Khalil Dewan, who has been tracking drone strikes during the war on terror and is also head of investigations at Stoke White law firm. Great to have all of you with us. When we're talking about the legacies of the post-9/11 wars, one of the legacies was the incarceration of suspected combatants, often without charge. And Moazzam, of course, you've experienced this at first hand. Looking back now, do you think that the war on terror has achieved anything towards reducing international terrorism?
Well, I think the first question to ask about that is, you mentioned Guantanamo Bay. It's now been open for close to 20 years, and not a single person out of almost 700 prisoners who were held there has been held for the reason why it was open, and that was to hold the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks to justice. So not a single person has been held to account. In fact, as a result of the detentions process in Bagram, Kandahar, and the secret detention sites, false information was gleaned and tortured out of victims like Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi, who was tortured by the Americans, captured in Afghanistan, and then tortured into giving a false confession in Egypt that Saddam Hussein was working with al-Qaeda on obtaining weapons of mass destruction. That became the key fake evidence, which became the justification for the invasion of Iraq. The Iraq invasion itself caused the rise of ISIS, and ISIS actually grew in Camp Booker, which was run by General Jeffrey Miller, who actually ran Guantanamo Bay. So you can see that the trajectory and the effects of the invasions, Guantanamo Bay, the detentions process, actually produced something far, far worse. And 20 years later, we have nothing to show for it except the loss of the US-led coalition and the victory of the Taliban.
Well, the US would say they tracked down and killed Osama bin Laden, who was the architect of the 9/11 attacks, and they have drastically reduced the capacity of al-Qaeda across Iraq and the Middle East. Are those not tangible goals that they have achieved?
Not if you've created something worse than al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, you had al-Qaeda, but al-Qaeda now has actually franchises in the Maghreb, in AQAP, in the southern peninsula of Arabia. You have ISIS and its various offshoots. You have Boko Haram. In fact, you have a whole load of groups that never existed before that make al-Qaeda look relatively tame. And as I said, Osama bin Laden, in fact, isn't the architect of 9/11. The architect is allegedly Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who's actually in Guantanamo, but he can't be prosecuted in a US court of law because he was tortured over 183 times using waterboarding, which evidence from which cannot be admitted into a court of law. So they've stuck him into a Guantanamo kangaroo court, and they've been unable to prosecute him. And it's unbelievable because after this, whatever happened on 9/11 wasn't worse than what happened in World War II and when 60 million people were killed. And yet we were able to prosecute in the Nuremberg trials within a year or two the Nazi architects of the entire war. So what it tells you is that the system is entirely broken, and the US has failed in stopping terrorism. In fact, they created more terrorism as a result of the response to 9/11.
Well, let's look at that in more detail. Khalil, the war may be over in Afghanistan, but the West, especially the US, is still involved in operations elsewhere, Iraq, Somalia.
Yeah, I think it's very important when we discuss the legacy of the war on terror that we discuss raids, drone strikes, as well as carpet bombings. And the reason for that is clear, that it's been taking place in 7 different countries, including Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, Libya, Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq, and maybe others in the future. Let's see what happens in the conflict dynamics. But the most important point to make today is that over 930,000 people have been killed post 9/11 wars without any legal recourse to justice. And this is highly problematic for victims who have experienced extrajudicial killings and haven't had any means to fight their corner or transparency over that. Recently, I just spoke to a group of former US drone pilots who were conducting drone strikes in Afghanistan. And they said to me, the numbers which have been published recently are completely bogus. We will never know, quote unquote, we will never know the real impact and the lives lost within the war on terror.
And those drone strikes were a huge controversy when we were talking about the, as you say, the hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths. And yet you're saying they're still continuing, despite assurances that drone strikes are supposed to be these extra precise methods, weapons of war.
Yeah, precisely. It's become the weapon of choice for targeting individuals as well as signature strikes. So you're targeting people based on their behavior on the ground, tracking SIM cards. So it's effectively 20 years of assassinations around the world without any accountability or transparency. Very highly problematic from a geopolitical, political, and legal point of view. Throughout the war on terror, we've heard that Haqqani has been killed several times throughout the war on terror, in fact. And recently we heard that he was appointed as the interior minister of the Taliban government in Afghanistan. The question is, who has been killed in these strikes? And it's the civilians. Civilians are taking the brunt of these strikes.
And I know that when you talk about people and civilians being killed, we are generally talking about Muslim people and civilians being killed. And Sahar, this is one of the biggest things that happened after 9/11, this marked shift in how Muslim communities were perceived. Just describe for us how the war on terror transformed the lives of Muslims around the world.
Well, before I do that, I'd just like to point out that many of us in the United States and across the world who pay attention to international relations understand that the war on terror was a pretext for the United States to remove Saddam Hussein illegally under international law, because as we know, Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi regime had nothing to do with September 11th, and that the basis for which the US claimed it was legal for preemptive self-defense was a lie, which was that they were manufacturing uranium in preparation for nuclear weapons. The U.S. also wanted to have control over Afghanistan, and much of it was related to their attempts to occupy or at least have regime change in Iran. So the war on terror just provided a very convenient cover for these larger geopolitical goals that, as my colleagues on the panel have said, actually produced more terrorism by allowing these terrorist groups to have more branches, such as Al-Qaeda, and then having new terrorist groups that are even more vicious than Al-Qaeda, which is ISIS. And the data shows clearly that the biggest victims of these terrorist groups, the largest number of their victims, are Muslims, because they're operating in the Middle East. And so although their proclaimed enemy is the United States and Western countries, or their puppet regimes in these Muslim majority countries, the real victims who are dying from their terrorism are Muslims. Now, Muslims are also the people who are being collectively punished in the West as diasporas, because what the war on terror did is it inundated U.S. public, and I'm sure in Europe as well, with images of Middle Easterners, Afghans, Iranians, people who are from Muslim majority countries, inundated the public with images of them only as terrorists. So the only understanding of these very diverse regions of the world who are majority Muslim is that they are terrorists.
And so this led to a rise of Islamophobia across not just the United States, but across Europe.
Right. So as a result, you have state Islamophobia through national security policies that target Muslims in immigration, deportation, exclusion, as we saw with the Muslim ban in 2017, but it started with the Bush administration's special registration of only Muslim non-immigrants, of the Absonder initiative, which focused on deportation of Arabs and Middle Easterners, of material support to terrorism prosecutions that targeted only Muslim communities and attempted to stop any charitable giving to conflict zones in Muslim majority countries. And then you have private Islamophobia, which is the private individuals getting the signal from the government saying it's okay to suspect Muslims. It's rational, it's patriotic, and in fact, please help us, because if you see something, say something. And that was a formal government program, which is effectively trying to create a citizen spy network and snitch network, which is ironically what Saddam Hussein did with his own country.
Let's look a bit closer at that link between the perception of Muslim communities and how they're being linked with terrorism. This is what the former British Prime Minister had to say when he was addressing the Rusi think tank just a few days ago.
In my view, Islamism, both the ideology and the violence, is a first-order security threat, and unchecked, it will come to us, even if centered far from us, as 9/11 demonstrated.
Moazzam, what do you think of that assessment of Islamism from the man who was in charge in Britain when the war on Afghanistan and Iraq began?
One of the things here is that Tony Blair was actually the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom when the famous Good Friday Agreement was signed between the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, and Britain. And interestingly, that ended a conflict that lasted at least 3 to 4 decades, in which 3,000 plus people died through bombings, through shootings, assassinations, kidnappings, and so forth. Despite that, you've had approximately in the UK something close to less than 100 people killed over a 20-year period from quote-unquote Islamic-related terrorism. But what you've also had is a new anti-terror legislation almost every year, which starts from the detention of people without charge or trial here in the UK, not in Guantanamo. 13 North African Middle Eastern men were detained in high-security Belmarsh for 3 years without charge. And the House of Lords, the Supreme Court of the country at the time, ruled that their detention had been illegal. But that didn't stop the legislation passing through again under Tony Blair, putting people under house arrest, control orders, internal exile. And the list went on and on up until the point at which you found, as in 2015, the Counterterrorism and Security Act, that there was a legal duty put upon our schools, our colleges, our nurseries, for goodness sake, for the children to be reported to prevent officers and the police for signs of radicalization. And that radicalization sometimes manifested itself in a completely ridiculous way, where a child, for example, mispronounces the word cucumber and is interpreted by the teacher as cooker bomb. And that child and its parents are referred to prevent officers to see if there's a sign of radicalization in the house.
So I mean, the whole point of the counter-terrorism law was to stop all terrorism. But in practice, it's being aimed at a specific community.
Precisely. And one of the things that's happened as a direct result of targeting Muslims, of the Islamophobia, is actually the rise of the far right. So up until a certain point, the far right weren't really carrying out attacks as high profile as Muslim attacks were. But then an MP, a member of Parliament, Joe Cox, was killed by somebody from the far right called Thomas Mair. Then they started to apply these anti-terror legislations, or the attempt to at least say that we're also applying it to the far right, therefore it's fit for all. But in reality, what it shows is that all of the anti-terror legislation from 2000 up until now mostly has shown that it has been unfit for purpose, because the numbers of plots, violent plots, prevented through anti-terror legislation could be counted on one hand, because there are already police laws in place to be able to tackle terrorism from the time of the Irish Republican Army attacks in the UK. So what you've seen is a targeting of the Muslim community from a structural way. Islamophobia is very structural when it comes to the government and legislation.
Khalil, what Moazzam is saying about this this idea that people are being encouraged to look out for potential risks and threats and report on each other. There is a sort of a campaign, isn't there, or a policy in the UK called Prevent, which is about preventing radicalisation. Ostensibly on paper, it talks about stopping people being led into terrorism. In practice, what has that meant for Muslim communities?
Yeah, sure. So the Muslim communities, particularly in the UK, have been, feeling the brunt of a social engineering program, effectively monitoring their daily life, their culture, their interpretations of Islam, and as Moazzam, your guest, has mentioned, a very famous case of the cooker bomb case, which is, it kind of is emblematic of the issues regarding Prevent and the disproportional nature of its application. Under the Counter-Terrorism Securities Act, I believe Part 5, 2015 legislation, people working within nurseries, schools, universities, as well as any public sector organization has a legal duty to effectively spy on members of the Muslim community. And that has been blurred by Islamophobia, as well as the rhetoric of the media on the war on terror, which is why we see disproportional reporting on Prevent referrals. And in all of this, the major point to make in consideration of Tony Blair's recent violence that he was espousing, behind the Rusi wall, is that white supremacy terrorism is sidelined. When we saw what happened a couple of years ago in Christchurch, it was not dealt, under the banner of terrorism. It did not have the same narrative nor the structure of counterterrorism. The intelligence agencies at the time, which I personally also investigated on the ground, sidestepped all of these victims' testimonies that I gathered. And they all said one thing: we've been complaining about this threat, but there was no real movement from law enforcement. Right.
So violence from one community is seen as terrorism, violence from another is not. I have to say, though, Tony Blair's view is not an isolated one. I mean, we had the French Prime Minister Emmanuel Macron a few weeks ago talking about how he regards Islam as problematic. Are governments disproportionately targeting Muslim communities then when it comes to trying to prevent terror attacks?
Absolutely. I can talk, at least in the U.S. context, the January 6th attempted insurgency, which is an unprecedented event, is a direct result of the government's negligence and recklessness in not following the threat and instead allowing stereotyping and racism to shape their homegrown terrorism policies or their domestic terrorism policies.
Well, arguably that was one president's opinions and which he used to shape his policies.
Except these groups have been growing over at least the past 10 to 15 years with the beginning of the Tea Party movement. And in fact, their recruitment really exponentially increased during the Obama administration because it was the first African-American president to be elected, and anti-Black racism started to pervade the far right and even moved into the moderate Republican Party. And then you have that merge with Islamophobia, which is why it was not a coincidence that the slurs against Obama were that he was a secret Muslim, that his birth certificate was questionable, and the implication was he's really from Kenya or Indonesia or some Muslim majority country, and he's trying to take over the United States as part of an internal invasion.
I just want to talk about the price of the US campaign against global terrorism. There was a recent report from the Costs of War project at Brown University revealing 20 years of post-9/11 wars have cost an estimated $8 trillion, killed more than 900,000 people, as Khalil was saying. Stephanie Saville, the co-director of the Costs of War project, says 20 years from now, we'll still be reckoning with the high societal costs of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars long after US forces are gone. And they pose the question, you know, what exactly has been achieved in 20 years of post-9/11 wars? Moazzam, presumably you'd say nothing.
Well, there has, and that is the war on terror is not over. In fact, there's a different part of it that's been announced, and it's by the most unlikely country you can imagine, and that is China. China has declared a people's war on terror. Xi Jinping is recorded to have said that we must use in China the language of George Bush's war on terrorism in order to curtail the Uyghurs in East Turkestan in China. China now actually literally has taken Islamophobia that has been perpetuated in the West and has taken it to its next level and describes Islam as a mental illness. People are placed inside concentration camps en masse in their millions. They are forced to renounce their religion. They're forced to drink alcohol, eat pork, and so forth. And there's a systematic attempt by the Chinese government in the name of fighting extremism and terrorism in the same way as the United States has, is to say that the problem, in fact, as you said, Tony Blair said, the problem is Islam. The problem is Islamic beliefs. And every despot...
So they're hijacking that opinion, that perception, in order to further their own agenda in China. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, of course. I mean, there's Muslim populations everywhere. Muslims are 1.6 billion people on the planet. But you've found, for example, you have a Nobel Peace Prize winner, Aung San Suu Kyi, in Burma, Myanmar, who herself used the same language to describe the Rohingya people who were getting butchered in Burma. You found Hindu nationalism rising in India under Narendra Modi, who said the same thing about Muslims. So what happened is that people have taken this language. And if I may, just look at Brenton Tarrant. He's the guy who carried out the massacre in the school, in the mosques in Christchurch in New Zealand. He was listening to songs at the time when he was doing the shootings that celebrate Radovan Karadzic, the war criminal who had the killings of 8,000 Muslims in Bosnia during the war. He also celebrated and praised, now this is a guy from the far right, he's praising the Chinese Communist Party for its treatment of the Uyghurs of East Turkestan. That tells you that this Islamophobia ideology now, this narrative, has gone from left to right, from far left to far right, and met in between, and the Muslims are stuck in the middle.
I just want to ask a final question to you, Khalil. Do you think, looking forward now, with all the investigations that you've done, are we going to see a rebalancing of perceptions of Muslim communities now that the war in Afghanistan is over, or do you see these perceptions persisting?
Time will tell, but I don't think that the war on terror is over. I think the armed conflict, the US-led armed conflict in Afghanistan, has come to an end and a closure as far as we can see. Biden recently indicated an over-the-horizon strikes in Afghanistan against ISIL-K, with the first example being targeting an innocent family, including a 2-year-old child. But I think generally, when we think about counter-terrorism policies and laws, will they become more dilute? I'm not really sure about that. I think it will continue. We're already seeing different fronts open of the war on terror, one of them being West Africa. France are inviting other countries to join them in their military assault in West Africa, particularly Mali. And I think that's an area that's going to be a new concern for them.
OK, it's been a real pleasure to speak with all of you. We have to bring the discussion to an end. Thank you very much indeed for joining me, Moazzam Begg, Sahar Aziz and Khalil Dewan. And remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and all the team here, bye-bye. Thanks for watching.